Let's start with a soft step into context. The Tudor dynasty, reigning from 1485 to 1603, was essentially England's most glamorous soap opera. They gave us Henry VIII, the man who turned marriage into a national blood sport, and Elizabeth I, who treated celibacy like a political weapon. But the women orbiting them were far from passive players. In the Tudor court, morality was not about being good. It was about appearing good, while quietly doing whatever it took to survive. So when we say perverted, we're not just talking about lust or scandal. We're talking about women who bent the moral rules, sometimes for love, often for greed, and occasionally for sheer boredom. Let's begin with Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford. Yes, that Boleyn, the sister-in-law of Anne Boleyn, and quite possibly the least popular woman in Henry VIII's England. Jane's reputation was built on two talents, gossip and survival. She managed to outlive Anne Boleyn's fall, which was no small achievement, considering heads were dropping like daisies at that point. But Jane had one fatal flaw: she couldn't resist peeking into other people's bedrooms. When her sister-in-law and brother-in-law George Boleyn were accused of incest, yes, incest, Jane's testimony helped send them both to the block. Whether she lied or not remains murky. But it's safe to say she didn't mind playing informant. And if that seems low, she somehow found a way to go lower. Years later, Jane became lady-in-waiting to Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, the giggly teenage queen who thought royal marriage was just extended dating. Catherine had an affair with Thomas Culpeper, one of Henry's handsome gentlemen, and who helped arrange those secret nighttime meetings. Jane Boleyn. Imagine it, two women sneaking through palace corridors, giggling, plotting, risking everything, for love, or at least for a brief distraction from the king's gaudy presence. It ended, predictably, with everyone executed. Henry, of course, was shocked. He always was. But Jane? She finally ran out of lives. Her curiosity, that most perverted of Tudor vices, had finally done her in. Now let's turn to Anne Boleyn herself. She's often romanticized, the intelligent seductress, the tragic queen, the proto-feminist icon. But beneath the candlelit portraits and pearl choker myths, Anne played a game that required a certain flexibility. And understood something few women did in her time. That her body was both her only weapon and her biggest liability. She withheld sex from Henry VIII for 6 years. 6 years. That's not prudishness, that's strategy. In a court where every flirtation could become an execution, and transform chastity into leverage. And it worked. For a while. Henry broke his entire country away from the Pope just to bed her. That's not love. That's obsession with paperwork. But when Anne finally gave him a daughter instead of a son, the future Elizabeth I, Henry's passion cooled faster than his temper could rise. And here's where the perversion comes in. Not sexual, but psychological. Anne's charm turned to paranoia. Her wit became venom. And in the last months of her life, she flirted too freely, joked too sharply, and dared to act too equal. When her enemies accused her of adultery, and, yes, incest with her brother, it wasn't that people believed it. It's that they wanted to. Because no one likes a woman who uses intelligence as foreplay. Next, we drift to Mary Tudor, known to history as Bloody Mary. But for tonight, let's remember her less as a tyrant, and more as a profoundly lonely woman who made one of the most awkward royal marriages in European history. Mary was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII, raised devoutly Catholic, painfully obedient, and chronically unlucky. By the time she finally became queen, she was 40 and desperate for affection. So she married Philip II of Spain, a man as emotionally warm as a block of marble. When he arrived in England, the people hated him on sight. Foreign. Arrogant. Spanish. And worst of all, not remotely interested in his new wife. Their wedding night was, well, disappointing. Philip wrote to his father the next day. "I shall treat her well, even though she is no longer young." Which is courtly Spanish for "I did my duty, please don't make me do it again." But Mary, poor soul, convinced herself she was pregnant. She wasn't. It was likely a false pregnancy brought on by stress and hormonal imbalance. She decorated nurseries, bought baby clothes, and announced the happy news to the nation. But the months passed. No baby came. And Philip quietly left the country. A woman who burned hundreds for heresy. Yet died believing she'd been loved. That's perversion of a different kind, not of lust, but of hope. And then there's Elizabeth I, the so-called Virgin Queen. The woman who made celibacy into an empire. Elizabeth was surrounded by men who wanted her, politically, romantically, strategically, but she kept them all dangling like decorative swords. Robert Dudley, her lifelong favorite, shared her secrets, her chambers, and possibly her bed. But when his wife mysteriously fell down a staircase, Elizabeth kept her distance. She knew what scandal could do. Elizabeth's perversion was of control. She flirted with everyone, married no one, and ruled them all. Her court became a theater of frustration. Men adored her and despair of her in the same breath. And she loved it. Every time a courtier proposed, she smiled that cool smile and said something like, "I am already married, to England." Which is beautiful, poetic, and completely deranged. She weaponized purity. Turned loneliness into majesty. And perhaps died untouched, though surrounded by a nation that worshipped her body like a relic. So what do we make of all this? These so-called perverted women, the schemers, seductresses, saints, and spies, weren't moral failures. They were survivors in a system designed to consume them. Each used what she had, charm, cunning, piety, or patience. Some won briefly. Most didn't. But all left a mark. The real perversion wasn't in their actions. It was in the world that demanded perfection. Then punished them for trying to live. Soft outro, gentle, slow, warm tone. So as you drift off tonight, maybe think of the Tudors not as monsters or martyrs, but as exhausted humans, performing on a stage they never built. And if you ever feel like your own life is messy or misunderstood, just remember, at least you're not being accused of sleeping with your brother while a king watches from a tapestry. Sleep well, traveler. History will still be here when you wake. Let's glide softly now to one of the saddest, strangest figures in Tudor history. Catherine Howard. Catherine was Henry VIII's fifth wife. A teenager, somewhere between 16 and 18, when she married a man in his late 40s who could barely walk without help. The court called her lively, sweet, playful. Henry called her a rose without a thorn. And yes, the universe laughed immediately. Catherine came from the fringes of nobility, raised not by her parents but in the household of her step-grandmother, the formidable Duchess of Norfolk. There, she learned her letters, and also, shall we say, the extracurricular side of courtly life. Catherine had a taste for charm and flattery. Men noticed her. She noticed them noticing. It was all very innocent, until it wasn't. By the time she married Henry, she already had a questionable romantic resume. And unlike Anne Boleyn, she wasn't a strategist. She was just young. Too young to understand that the king's attention was less like love and more like a bear hug. But Catherine made one fatal mistake. She got bored. The old king would eat his way through banquets while she danced with courtiers her own age. Among them was Thomas Culpeper, charming, reckless, and apparently worth dying for. Lady Rochford, our old friend from Part 1, helped arrange the secret meetings. A darkly familiar pattern. But this time, the outcome was inevitable. Once discovered, Catherine was arrested. When she was told she would die, she asked for the execution block to be brought to her cell so she could practice placing her head on it properly. She died calmly, with the dignity no one ever let her live with. And Henry? He wept. Briefly. Then married again. Because of course he did. Catherine Howard's so-called perversion wasn't lust. It was joy, the one thing no one in that palace could tolerate. Now, while kings and queens were destroying each other upstairs, there was another sort of woman thriving just beneath them. One like Mary Shelton, a lady-in-waiting to Anne Boleyn, and a quiet literary rebel. Mary was known for her sharp wit and her sharper quill. She contributed verses to the Devonshire manuscript, a secret collection of love poetry passed around by Tudor courtiers. It was essentially the 16th century version of a shared Google Doc full of flirtatious gossip. Mary's poems mixed theology and desire, like, "O love, thou art my God and grief alike," which, in Tudor terms, was both erotic and slightly heretical. She also caught Henry VIII's eye for a while, though to be fair, so did most things that moved. But Mary didn't become his mistress. She wrote. She teased. She made men chase her intellect instead of her body. In a world that measured women by purity, she turned language into rebellion. That was her perversion, a sensuality of the mind. And frankly, a more dangerous kind. Now let's drift toward Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife. And the only one who managed to survive him. Which, statistically, deserves applause. Catherine was twice widowed before marrying Henry. Educated, eloquent, and mature enough to hide her panic when the proposal came. Imagine knowing the man asking for your hand had already executed 2 of his wives and annulled another 2. That's not romance. That's a job hazard. But Catherine was clever. She realized Henry's ego could be soothed by flattery disguised as theology. So she played nurse, scholar, and saint, sometimes all in one afternoon. Her interest in Protestant reform nearly got her killed. She kept forbidden books, discussed religion too openly, and once argued scripture with the king himself. Naturally, Henry didn't enjoy being corrected by his wife. A warrant was prepared for her arrest. But by a stroke of timing, or instinct, she fell at Henry's feet and tearfully confessed she only debated with him to learn from his superior wisdom. He melted. And burned the warrant. She survived him by about a year. Married again, for love this time, to the dashing Thomas Seymour. He, of course, fell in love with someone else, the teenage Elizabeth. Tudor men really had one talent. Catherine died in childbirth, exhausted and betrayed. Her life had been a balancing act between devotion and danger. Her perversion was intellect, and the audacity to use it. By now, you've probably noticed a pattern. In the Tudor court, lust wasn't private. It was policy. Courtiers flirted as strategy. Letters dripped with innuendo carefully phrased to survive if intercepted. "Your heart is my captive," might really mean, "I'll support your faction if you don't tell the queen." Mistresses were currency. Rumors were weapons. Virginity was leverage, and sometimes, fiction. The most famous courtesans didn't always sleep with anyone. They just let people believe they might. A promise was more powerful than the act itself. It could ruin, manipulate, or elevate. The most perverted thing about Tudor sexuality wasn't what happened in bed, it was the theater around it. The endless pretending. The performance of purity and sin, both rehearsed daily. Even under the Virgin Queen, the game continued. Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting were the most scrutinized women in England, and, naturally, they still managed to cause chaos. Take Lettice Knowles, for instance, Elizabeth's cousin and near twin in looks. She went and married Robert Dudley, the very man Elizabeth loved most. Without asking. It did not go well. Elizabeth banished her from court for life. And she never forgave her. Lettice was called the she-wolf. But honestly, she just did what Elizabeth never could. She loved openly. Then there was Elizabeth Throckmorton, another maid who secretly married Sir Walter Raleigh. When the Queen found out, she threw them both in the Tower. The charge? Disobedience. Which in Tudor English meant, you made the Queen feel feelings. Elizabeth's court ran on jealousy disguised as virtue. The Virgin Queen demanded purity around her, not because she valued it, but because it reminded her she'd chosen the lonelier path. Her women, meanwhile, slipped love letters under doors and risked death for kisses. Because that's what happens when repression becomes routine. The Tudor obsession with morality created an empire of spies. There were always eyes watching: servants, confessors, ambassadors, even bedchamber attendants. Privacy barely existed. A queen's virtue was everyone's business. Her letters were read. Her body examined. Her words recorded. This was not an age of innocence. It was an age of surveillance. Even love became performative. Every sigh might be a coded message. Every poem could be treason in verse form. The Tudors turned desire into paperwork. And that, truly, is the most English perversion of all. Much of what we know about these women comes not from official chronicles, but from gossip, letters, diaries, and scandalous rumors recorded by men who couldn't decide whether to adore or condemn them. There's Eustace Chapuis, the Spanish ambassador, who wrote more about Anne Boleyn's alleged love life than her actual politics. Or George Wyatt, who described Catherine Howard's flirtations in tones of both disgust and fascination. Even the chroniclers were infected by the court's voyeurism. They wrote as though sin were entertainment, which, to be fair, it still is. But the women themselves? They rarely got to speak. Their voices were filtered through the men who judged them. And so their perversion was often just a convenient story, a way to make sense of a woman who didn't fit neatly into obedience. When the Tudor line finally ended with Elizabeth's death in 1603, it left behind more than an empty throne. It left a nation obsessed with moral appearance. The Stuart kings who followed tried to outdo Tudor excess with their own scandals, but none had the same theatrical restraint. The Tudors had made desire elegant. Even their corruption wore velvet. The women we've drifted through tonight, and Jane, Mary, Catherine, Elizabeth, all lived in a gilded cage built from male paranoia. Their sins were often survival strategies. Their pleasures, small rebellions. It's strange how history condemns them while praising the kings who destroyed them. But that's the quiet cruelty of time. It remembers the noise and forgets the nuance. And now, as the Tudor candles fade in your imagination, let's breathe out the noise. The gossip. The accusations. The endless rehearsals of purity and power. These women, brilliant, foolish, tender, dangerous, remind us that history is never just facts. It's emotion wrapped in costume. Every courtly smile hid a fear. Every secret meeting, a gamble. And every rumor, a heartbeat. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, perhaps think of them not as the perverted women of the Tudor era, but as the restless souls who lived in a world that confused love with politics. They survived for a time. They were remembered for the wrong reasons. And yet, they're still here. Still whispering through the candlelight of history. Good night. Sleep well. And remember, history never sleeps. It just waits for you to close your eyes. Pompeii before the eruption was lively in the way seaside resort towns always are. It was slightly tacky, slightly rich, and full of people who believed nothing truly bad could happen to them. The population was somewhere around 10 to 12,000. Enough to keep the bakeries busy, the bathhouses steamy, and the gossip properly circulating. Villas glittered on the slopes, with painted courtyards and small fountains that made the kind of soft burbling sound that rich people have always found reassuring. The city's walls were old, but its mood was young. Frescoes of gods and lovers brightened the plaster. Wine flowed cheaply. And the brothels, well, they had mosaics so explicit that later archaeologists had to invent new filing systems just to catalog them discreetly. Pompeii was a city that enjoyed life without ever considering the cost of it. Which, in hindsight, feels very Roman. Vesuvius loomed nearby, green and quiet. A pleasant backdrop for vineyards. Its slopes were lined with grapes, olives, and the kind of lazy charm that convinces people that nature is harmless. No one thought of it as dangerous. Because, technically, no one alive remembered it ever erupting. The last major explosion had been centuries before, so ancient that even Roman historians didn't mention it clearly. Pliny the Elder, the great Roman naturalist and enthusiastic know-it-all, once wrote about the region's fine wines and fertile soil, never quite connecting that fertility to volcanic ash. Which feels about right. Vesuvius, in short, was the kind of neighbor who'd been quiet for so long that everyone forgot he had a temper. It began like any other summer morning. Markets opened. Fish were brought in from the bay. Bakers stoked their ovens. And a few minor tremors went unnoticed, or at least unbothered. The people of Pompeii were used to earthquakes. They happened often enough to be annoying, but not alarming. It was like living near train tracks, the shaking just became part of the ambience. Around midday, though, the mountain changed its mind. A deep rumble rose from below. The sky darkened, not with storm clouds, but with something heavier, stranger. And from the peak of Vesuvius burst a towering column of ash and gas, stretching more than 10 miles into the sky. Pliny the Younger, who was across the bay in Misenum, later described it as resembling a pine tree, tall, branching, beautiful, and horrifying all at once. Imagine standing in the sunlight and watching the sky turn solid. That's how it began. Now, Pliny the Elder, commander of the Roman fleet at Misenum, did what any confident Roman intellectual would do in a life-threatening situation. He decided to get a closer look. When messengers arrived begging for help, he treated the eruption as both a rescue mission and a field study. He ordered his ships prepared, took his notebooks, and sailed directly toward the mountain that was actively destroying the coastline. Because of course he did. Pliny was a man who believed knowledge could defeat danger. He had, after all, written 37 volumes of natural history, covering everything from medicine to meteorology. Unfortunately, none of those volumes included a chapter titled How to Outrun Volcanic Gas. He sailed into the falling ash, tried to land, and was overwhelmed by toxic fumes. His body was found later, unburned, but collapsed. A man defeated not by ignorance, but by curiosity. And that, perhaps, is the most Roman way to go. Meanwhile, in Pompeii, panic arrived slowly. Ash fell lightly at first, like gray snow. People swept it from their thresholds. Some gathered valuables, others went to the temples. Many simply stayed indoors, assuming it would pass. But the sky grew darker, the air thicker. Ash turned to pumice, hot stones falling fast enough to shatter roofs. Windows broke. Dogs barked until they choked. And the city, once alive with sound, began to fill with the muffled thuds of collapse. By evening, Vesuvius had transformed into a monster. The column above it began to collapse under its own weight, sending surges of gas and ash, pyroclastic flows, racing down the slopes. They moved faster than horses could gallop, hotter than any forge. Those who stayed behind had no time to run. Their last moments, preserved by the ash, still lie there, caught mid-step, mid-breath, mid-prayer. Across the bay, another town, Herculaneum, faced a different fate. Smaller, wealthier, closer to the sea. When the eruption began, the wind carried most of the ash away, sparing it, briefly. People fled to the waterfront, hoping to escape by ship. Then, without warning, the first pyroclastic surge reached them. A blast of gas and ash nearly 500 degrees Celsius, moving like a wall. Death was instant. The heat left skeletons where bodies had been, curled forms that archaeologists found centuries later in boat houses by the shore. But because the flow buried the city under 60 feet of volcanic rock, much of it was sealed perfectly. Wood, furniture, scrolls, even loaves of bread, all preserved, blackened but intact. It's morbid, but also oddly domestic. Herculaneum is less a ruin and more a time capsule of interrupted living. Part 7, the morning after, silence and smoke. When dawn came, the landscape looked nothing like Italy. The bay was choked with floating debris. The sky was yellow-gray. And where Pompeii had stood, there was now only a low, steaming plain of ash. For days, survivors wandered along the coast, calling names that were never answered. Animals were dead, wells poisoned, fields buried. The world had changed, and Rome, ever practical, soon moved on. A tragedy, yes. But there were taxes to collect elsewhere. Pompeii simply vanished from memory. Its location forgotten, its name eventually confused with others. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell above its sleeping streets. Until one day, someone digging a canal struck marble. Fast forward to the 18th century. An engineer tunneling near Naples stumbled upon frescoes, vivid, scandalous, unmistakably Roman. Soon, the ground was being peeled back, revealing rooms, bodies, and everyday objects perfectly frozen in time. Europe was fascinated. Aristocrats took guided tours of death. Ladies fainted at erotic wall paintings. Scholars argued over whether the sight was tragic or titillating. The irony was that the eruption, which had destroyed the city in a day, had also granted it immortality. Pompeii became a mirror for every later generation's anxieties about luxury, fate, and the fragility of civilization. The more we uncovered, the more uncomfortably familiar it felt. Half-finished chores. Abandoned pets. Lovers in an embrace that might have been comfort, or despair. Time had stopped mid-sentence. And we were the readers, arriving late. Much of what we know comes from one man, Pliny the Younger, nephew of the ill-fated elder. He was 17 during the eruption, and his letters to the historian Tacitus remain our best first-hand account. He described the strange, dark daylight, the shaking earth, the screams, and his uncle's doomed bravery. But what stands out most is his tone. Calm, observant, detached, even when describing panic. It's as if the Romans, raised to revere stoicism, couldn't quite allow emotion even while watching the sky collapse. Their instinct was to describe, not to feel. To make sense of the senseless. Which, in fairness, is something we still do. The famous casts of Pompeii, those haunting figures preserved in ash, weren't discovered until the 1800s. Excavators noticed that the hollow spaces in the hardened ash contained bones. They poured plaster into them, and when it hardened, the forms of men, women, children, and animals emerged. You can still see them today. A mother shielding her child. A man lying face down, arms outstretched. A dog, still chained to its post. Each one captured in a pose of pure, human fear. And yet, there's something gentle about them too. The ash became a shroud, a sculptor, and a historian all at once. It's one of those rare moments where destruction and preservation become the same thing. It's easy to wonder why so many stayed behind. Why they didn't run sooner. But the truth is painfully ordinary. Some didn't believe it was serious. Some couldn't leave the sick or elderly. Some waited for husbands or wives who never came back. And some, quite simply, thought it rude to abandon their homes. Humans, it turns out, are excellent at ignoring catastrophe until it's unavoidable. We build routines around danger and call it normal. Pompeii just happened to be an extreme version of that. The eruption of Vesuvius didn't just bury a city, it buried an age. The Roman world was never quite the same afterward. Not because of the physical loss, but because it revealed how small even Rome was against nature. For centuries, Vesuvius remained quiet again. Then it erupted in 1631. Then again in 1944. Each time, a reminder that memory isn't always safety. But we still live around it. Still plant vines on its slopes. Still call it beautiful. Because people, it seems, never quite believe that disaster is personal. There's something almost poetic about Pompeii's fate. A city famous for its pleasure and excess destroyed in a single day. And yet remembered forever for that destruction. If the Romans believed in omens, they might say the gods simply got bored. But maybe it's simpler. Maybe nature doesn't punish. Maybe it just forgets we're there. Pompeii, in all its tragic stillness, became the most vivid reminder of impermanence ever uncovered. The frescoes are bright, but the people are shadows. It's a museum of what was once alive. And every visitor who walks its streets hears the same soft whisper. You live now. But not forever. Point 2. So as we drift toward the end of tonight's story, picture the calm after the ash settled. The quiet that comes only when everything that could make noise is gone. Imagine that stillness. Not empty, but complete. A silence so vast it could cradle centuries. The Romans called Vesuvius Mons Vespius, the mountain of Bacchus, god of wine, of laughter, of life. It's fitting, really, that the god of joy also presided over such destruction. Because joy and ruin, in the end, are never far apart. Soft outro, slow, fading voice. So, if you're still awake, congratulations. You've outlasted the city of Pompeii. And if you're already drifting off, that's all right. The ashes will keep falling quietly without you. The streets will stay silent. And tomorrow, when you wake, the world will still be turning. Just as it always has. Even after everything burns. Good night, traveler. Sleep well. And remember, even in ruins, history breathes.